The hero of our story wished for a happy life, but he died before he could achieve it. Fortunately, he was reincarnated into the body of a young man from a wealthy family, just as he had always hoped. However, he soon discovered that he was now living in the kingdom he once fought against. Not only that, but the young man whose body he now inhabited was a scoundrel destined to die within 2 years. Will our hero be able to change his fate and finally live the life he had always dreamed of? That's what we'll find out in today's story. Our story begins with a group of heroes attempting to prevent the end of the world. As humanity's last hope, they ultimately fail. Ivan, their leader, offers an apology, admitting he was not up to the task. With deep regret, he confesses that Chris should have been the true hero. A girl interrupts him, asking him not to say that. She then adds sorrowfully that they had done all they could. Ivan responds by pointing out that if the brilliant Chris had learned swordsmanship earlier, he could have surpassed the 9th level, reached the 10th, and stopped the apocalypse. Chris, known as the Great Extra, is the protagonist of our story, and he earned this title thanks to his absurd ability to master anything at an incredible speed, regardless of the field. His story began at the age of 20, a young man with dreams of success who had fled his broken family and lived in the slums. Around that time, humanity came under attack from the Magic Empire, led by the Demon Emperor. A public call was made for assistance to join the hero's party that would stand against the invasion. Chris saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. Without hesitation, he signed up, dreaming of the riches that would be his if they succeeded. But unfortunately, they were defeated, and the forces of light fell to the Demon Emperor. We return now to Chris and Ivan, who wishes he could go back in time and choose Chris as the hero from the start. Chris, however, firmly rejects that idea, having no desire to relive such a bitter life. Besides, time travel wasn't possible to begin with. The three share a final look at the world crumbling before them, and at that moment, Chris realizes this truly is the end. As his body begins to fade, he mocks the idea of a second life and idly wishes he had been born the son of a rich man, if such a new life were real. And then, it happens. Chris wakes up in the body of a young noble within the Magic Empire. The family he belongs to hails from the Dark Maga bloodline, one of the 12 noble houses that support the empire. Upon investigation, he discovers he has gone back 15 years in time. This means he has only 5 years before the Demon Emperor's invasion begins. Even though Chris believed he'd seen it all in his previous life, he hadn't expected to look out his window and see demons gardening. What unsettled him most was that he recognized the identity of the person whose body he now inhabited. His name was Chris Van Kazar. Chris remembered hearing a friend mention that name before. He immediately understood that the Van indicated a lesser demonic bloodline. His friend had praised his sharp mind and explained that the Kazar family was a branch of the Baron household, part of the infamous Dark Maga line. Chris asked if that meant the Kazar family was minor. She replied no, and clarified that even as a branch family, they were still considered part of the Dark Maga line, and given their wealth, there wasn't a single demon in the empire unfamiliar with the name Kazar. She went on to say that the Kazar family had 2 heirs, the elder son, Chris, who had been a complete scoundrel in every sense, a disgrace of a young man who did nothing but cause trouble, to the point his family had lost all hope in him. But that was in the past, she added, prompting Chris to ask if she meant he had changed. Her answer was blunt. He had been killed by his own family. We return to the present, where Chris is horrified by the fate of the man whose life he now leads. He slams his fist against the wall, overwhelmed by the irony of having wished to be the son of a rich man. He begins to wonder why he was brought back to life, and why in this specific place. And above all, why he had to end up in the body of a wretch who had only moments left to live. Chris sinks into despair, trying to calm himself so he can find a way out of this impossible situation. Time passes, and it has now been 3 days since Chris regained consciousness in the body of the young man who shares his name, the same one who is supposed to be killed 2 years from now. Chris considers the possibility that the family might have executed him for being a scoundrel who committed terrible acts, so perhaps behaving properly could help him avoid such a fate. Now that he is the son of a wealthy man, he believes he might finally live the life he had always dreamed of. But just then, something critical crosses his mind, something he had forgotten, and that realization crushes any hope of fulfilling that dream. The matter is Ragnarok, or the end of the world. Chris remembers that the Demon Emperor's motive for starting the war was to activate Ragnarok by offering humans as sacrifices. Because Chris had failed to uncover this purpose in his previous life, both the forces of light and the Magic Empire were utterly destroyed. Now Chris knows that his survival depends on preventing that destruction. Although the Demon Emperor himself is an enormous threat, the greater danger lies in the vast number of demons loyal to him within the Magic Empire. If Chris is to win, he must surpass the Demon Emperor. And the only way to do that is to become the new Demon Emperor and rise to the top of the Magic Empire. At present, he still has 5 years before the invasion begins. Chris wonders if he should take the chance. After all, if he does nothing, death is inevitable. Besides, If he succeeds, he won't just own a mansion, he'll rule the entire empire. Later on, Chris finds himself in his father's office. The moment his father sees him, his anger flares. He yells at him, reminding him that he was told to stay in his room and reflect on his actions. But instead, he had the nerve to show up without shame after the disaster he caused. His fury grows as he threatens to behead him if he behaves so foolishly again. Under the heavy pressure from his father, Count Khazar, Chris responds that he came to apologize for all his past mistakes. His goal is to erase his old image as a disgrace so he can carry out his plan. Count Khazar is taken aback by his words, and Chris repeats his apology, assuring him that his behavior will not be repeated. But the Count remains unconvinced, insisting that such a sudden change is unbelievable given all the damage he had caused. Chris is disheartened, unable to figure out which of the many disasters is bothering his father most. Chris reminds him that 3 days ago, he mentioned losing part of his memory, and in trying to recall his past, he realized how awful he had been, which is why his regret is genuine this time. Still uneasy, Count Khazar says he has heard similar words too many times before. Chris insists that this time is different, admitting that an apology alone won't fix anything, and he asks to be sent to the punishment wing for a full month, to reflect and prove his sincerity. The punishment wing is a prison for high-ranking demons who commit serious crimes. It is a place untouched by light, where all 5 senses are sealed. Even a few days there are enough to break anyone, but Chris sees it as the perfect place to disappear from sight. Count Khazar asks if he's sure, warning him that someone like him wouldn't last even half a day. Chris responds that he knows how harsh the place is, but sees it as necessary to prove how serious he is. Khazar asks if he knows how many times he made similar promises only to let them down again. Even so, he agrees to give him one last chance to see what will happen. But he makes it clear that if Chris fails to show real change by the end of the month, he will be expelled from the family for good. Chris is fully aware of what that means. Without his family's protection, many would jump at the chance to kill him, and they won't hesitate. Even so, Chris responds immediately and confidently, telling his father that he agrees. However, he adds a condition. If he proves he has truly changed, there will be something he will ask of him. His father is irritated by his confident tone, remarking that he sounds as if he's certain he'll return unharmed. Still, he agrees to grant his request, if he keeps his word. He then leaves the office, convinced that Chris will never last. Sometime later, Chris sits in his room, holding something that looks like a gem in his hand. Cox, the family's servant, enters and informs him that the punishment wing is ready for his arrival. Chris places the gem on the table and leaves with him. On the way, Chris hears the servants whispering about him. They can't believe the family's disgrace is willingly heading to the punishment wing. They wonder what new scheme he's planning this time. Chris is drawn to their mention of a recent incident in which he insulted the young lady from the toxic Maga family, an event that forced Count Khazar to personally apologize, despite the rivalry between the two families. This left him in an extremely bad light and severely damaged his reputation. One servant sighs, wondering when that disgrace will finally grow up, and another replies that such a thing is utterly impossible. They then speculate on how long he'll last in the punishment wing. One says 2 days at most. Another argues he won't even make it through a single day. Chris and Cox continue on until they reach the punishment wing, where 2 intimidating guards stand at the entrance. Chris glances at one of them with curiosity, thinking to himself that employing Death Knights as guards is typical in the Magic Empire. Still, he doesn't care, as long as they're not coming in with him, so he keeps walking. Just before he enters, a voice calls out to him, "Brother." He turns to see a young boy standing behind him. Chris feels like he's seen him before. It's his younger brother, Turn, known as the model student. Chris is caught off guard when Turn suddenly draws a sword on him. Despite a surge of inner fear, he composes himself and calmly asks what he wants. Turn shouts, accusing him of being a constant disgrace to the family. He adds that, though he doesn't know what he's planning this time, if he shames the family again, he will kill him. In that moment, Chris realizes that the body's original owner was indeed killed by Turn, and he remembers meeting Turn during the invasion, where he had become a well-known demon skilled in curse magic. Chris notes that Turn looks quite innocent at this age and figures he must have trained hard. Even so, to someone like Chris, who survived the Age of Ruin, he's still just a child. With a serious tone, Chris tells Turn to lower his sword. Turn grows uneasy. Something feels off. Chris leaves him with a simple statement. He got the message, and urges him to mind his own business. Turn tries to issue another warning, but Chris ignores him and steps into the punishment wing. Frustrated by the embarrassing exchange, Turn yells furiously. Inside the punishment wing, Chris begins testing his senses. He finds he can't hear or see, though there's a faint sensation in his fingertips. He realizes his father must have allowed this minimal feeling so he could touch the items he brought with him. Otherwise, he would starve. Chris knows that any ordinary person would lose their mind in a place like this, but not him. He has faced worse while working as a treasure hunter, and the deprivation of his senses actually works in his favor, giving him the chance to focus inwardly without distraction. In doing so, he can begin repairing the damaged body he now inhabits, though the process will require immense time and effort, thanks to the medical skills he gained during his time under a saint, the body modification techniques he picked up from the circus, and the various mana stones in his possession. He believes he can achieve his goal. Chris pulls out one of the mana stones, admitting that he never imagined he'd get his hands on one due to their outrageous price. But then again, it's only natural for a noble family to fulfill even the whims of a disgrace like the one who used to own this body. Chris feels a pang of regret as he remembers how much he and Ivan had suffered just to get their hands on a mana stone like the one he's holding now. At that moment, he decides to begin his plan, starting with purifying his body using a white mana stone. Though the process is tedious, it's also the most crucial step, as he must cleanse all the areas where waste has built up in his body using pure white mana. One mistake during this phase could destroy his body completely. Not long after, Chris smiles. He's successfully completed the purification, and with surprising ease. We shift scenes to Count Khazar's office, where he asks Cox about Chris. Cox informs him that Chris voluntarily entered the punishment wing. Khazar feels uneasy, wondering if Chris had mentally broken down to the point where he could no longer ask for help, and regrets letting him go. He recalls how Chris had once been such a promising child, but then, little by little, things began to fall apart. He wonders if pride in his talents had been his undoing. Still, he doesn't dwell on the thought long, telling himself it would be better for Chris to end up crippled, or even dead, than to keep living the way he was. But then, the determined look he had seen on Chris's face resurfaces in his memory, stirring something in him. Even so, as he reflects on all the times he had been deceived, he concludes this time is likely no different. He asks Cox if anything strange happened when Chris entered the punishment wing. Noticing Cox's hesitation, he urges him to speak honestly without hiding anything. Cox explains that Chris had taken a collection of mana stones with him, including a hallucination stone, known to cause delusions. Given their uncertainty about the potential side effects, Cox suggests opening the punishment wing to check on him. Khazar's expression shifts to anger, and he insists that even if Chris is dying, the door will not be opened. Time passes, and after a month, Khazar stands before the punishment wing's entrance. He imagines what state Chris must be in. If he's even alive, he must be a wreck. But what he sees takes him by surprise. Chris emerges in excellent condition, showing no signs of suffering. Chris asks him why he's so surprised, and reminds him that he promised to change, and he kept his word. Khazar is visibly moved as he notices a look in Chris's eyes he hasn't seen since he was a child. Composing himself, he states plainly that it's clear Chris survived. Chris laughs, asking if that was meant as a compliment. Khazar snaps at him not to get cocky just for doing something so basic. Chris agrees, though he's quietly frustrated by his father's harshness. Even so, he feels satisfied, not just for surviving, but for achieving so much over the month. He had managed to reshape his body into one perfectly suited for swordsmanship, and thanks to the white mana stone, he felt vitality coursing through every cell. As for the hallucination stone, it turned out to be a stroke of genius. Though Cox had scolded him for using what was essentially a classified narcotic, it helped him drastically shorten the time needed for his full transformation. He also succeeded in creating 2 cores, making him a first-level light mage. He even concealed the light core within a dark core to avoid detection. Discovery would be disastrous. Chris tells his father that since he kept his promise, he has a request. When Khazar asks what it is, Chris requests permission to use the Black Forest Knights training grounds. Khazar grows visibly irritated upon hearing the request, telling him that place is not meant for someone like him. It's one of the 3 main facilities that support the Dark Maga family, and only elite knights are allowed to use it to hone and showcase their skills. Chris clarifies that he's not asking for more than access to the grounds, and believes witnessing the courage of the Black Forest Knights would be a great source of inspiration. His father considers his words for a moment, then agrees, but warns him not to show weakness in front of the Black Forest Knights. As Khazar turns to leave, Chris stops him, saying he has one more request. Time passes, and the story moves to the Black Forest Knights training grounds. 3 knights appear, looking curiously at a certain individual. That individual is revealed to be Chris, preparing to begin his training. Chris notices the gazes the young men are throwing his way, but he knows full well that being the Count's son isn't enough to earn their respect. Strength matters more than status in the Magic Empire. Chris had another reason for coming to the Black Forest Knights headquarters besides using the training grounds. That reason was the library, his second request to his father. However, his father made it conditional upon obtaining a recommendation letter from Vice Commander Merlin before granting him a key. The library is where the Khazar family stores their black magic tomes, and access to it is of great importance to Chris. When Chris protested, arguing that he had the right to enter as a family member, his father reminded him of the last time he was caught trying to steal the most valuable books to sell on the black market. That's when Chris realized the body's previous owner was truly a scoundrel. Still, he didn't take offense, as he already had a solid plan to earn Vice Commander Merlin's recognition quickly. At that moment, his brother Turn suddenly appears before him, surrounded by a group of young men, telling him this place isn't meant for a pest like him. Chris is annoyed by Turn confronting him again, and decides to ignore him. But then he pauses, smiling, as an idea comes to mind. Turn's appearance couldn't have been more timely. Turn approaches Chris with a sharp tone, telling him to leave unless he intends to die after barely surviving the punishment wing by sheer luck. Chris responds calmly, asking if Turn is ready to take responsibility for those words, then surprises him by stating that it was their father who gave him permission. Just then, someone steps in, acknowledging the Count's decision with respect. That person turns out to be none other than Merlin, the Vice Commander. Chris immediately senses that she's releasing magical pressure on him, at least 4th tier, but he's used to that kind of threat. He bows to greet her. Merlin is caught off guard when she notices that he's withstanding her pressure without showing signs of pain. Chris tells her that if that's the impression she has of him, then he'll prove he's worthy of using the training grounds. Merlin asks how he intends to do that, and Chris points toward Turn and his group, suggesting a duel with one of them. Merlin assumes he's joking, but Chris assures her he's completely serious, explaining that he has one condition: the duel must be fought with fists only, no magic involved, due to his weakened energy pathways from a life of excess. Merlin becomes uneasy. She can't allow him to enter a fight that might injure him, especially since, at the end of the day, he's the Count's son. She asks if he truly believes he has a chance simply because it's hand-to-hand combat. Chris replies that the only way to know is to test it, then wonders aloud who the ideal opponent might be. He points to Turn, saying he'd make a fitting choice. Turn takes offense, assuming Chris is mocking him. Merlin steps in and tells Chris to choose someone else, since Turn is already at the 2nd level. Chris is surprised to hear that, as reaching that level isn't easy, not even for those over 30. Still, he isn't worried. After all, he's no ordinary scoundrel. Chris tells Merlin that if he really wants to prove himself, he needs to face someone stronger, making Turn the ideal opponent. He then smiles and turns to Turn, asking if he's afraid. Turn becomes even more enraged and agrees to the duel. The spectators gather to see what will happen, all cheering for Turn, shouting at him to crush that disgrace. Chris sarcastically asks Merlin how they'll determine the winner. Fed up with his arrogance, Merlin declares that the winner will be whoever renders their opponent completely immobile, secretly hoping Turn will break his leg. Chris starts provoking Turn, saying that if those are the rules, he'll beat him until he can't move. Turn is livid and vows to silence him for good, but suddenly Chris lunges and delivers a solid punch straight to Turn's face. Turn is caught off guard by what just happened, while Chris laughs and says the fight has already begun. Turn grows even more furious and rushes in to attack, but Chris dodges with ease, thinking to himself that this almost feels like cheating. After all, as a mage, he hasn't even reached the 1st level. If this were a magic battle, he wouldn't stand a chance. But in a hand-to-hand fight, Chris has the upper hand, thanks to his vast combat experience from countless battles. Not to mention the level of light energy he achieved during his time in the punishment wing, which, by their standards, equates to the 3rd tier. The young onlookers are stunned by what they're witnessing. No one imagined Chris could gain the upper hand over Turn so easily. Chris keeps taunting Turn, asking if he's about to cry. Enraged, Turn demands to know what trick he used. Chris, secretly delighted by Turn's state, replies that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and maybe the real issue is just how weak he is. He then continues mocking him even more harshly. Turn finally snaps and begins channeling his magic. He lunges at Chris, screaming that he'll kill him. As usual, Chris dodges without breaking a sweat. Turn launches another, faster attack, but it still doesn't land. Not only that, but Chris even blocks it with his bare hand. Turn is stunned when he realizes Chris is using magical power. Before he can process what's happening, Chris slams a powerful punch into him, sending him flying. Turn crashes to the ground, unconscious from the blow. Everyone around them is speechless, unable to believe what they've just seen. One of them wonders if Turn underestimated his opponent, while another suggests maybe he held back his magic to avoid hurting Chris. But Merlin knows full well that Chris won fairly, and she is genuinely shocked. Chris turns to her and asks if that was enough to prove himself. When she confirms, he thanks her. Chris feels a quiet joy. He's finally caught her attention. Now he can gain access to sword techniques, magic, and everything else he needs. Time passes, and Chris finally reaches the 1st level of magic. He realizes it takes him a long time, since he's still not used to handling mana, and there are many unresolved issues from the past he needs to address. He says that once he rises a little higher, he'll be able to control both light energy and mana together. At that moment, a strange creature appears out of nowhere. It turns out to be Chris's personal maid. Chris is startled and remarks that someone like Christian would naturally summon a banshee spirit as a maid. No human soul could handle his madness. He decides to deal with the matter later, and asks the banshee to bring him some juice before he continues his training. She asks if human blood juice would be suitable, and Chris replies that he just wants regular strawberry juice. She moves closer, insisting that blood juice would taste far better. Chris becomes uneasy and firmly repeats that he wants strawberry juice, nothing else. As he steps out of his room, he's met by the servant Cox, who asks why he's going to train this early and remarks that Chris might be overdoing it. He adds that he's proud of him for working so hard, and that even when everyone else was accusing him, he always believed in him. Chris responds in a cold tone tinged with malice, saying he never asked for his trust, and questions who he thinks he is to offer it in the first place. Cox is visibly shaken. He quickly apologizes, admitting he was arrogant and overstepped, then wishes the young master a good training session. Chris watches him walk away, still feeling uneasy. Something about Cox doesn't sit right with him. There's something suspicious behind that servant, and even his presence feels unnatural. Chris finally arrives at the training grounds and notices that the looks he's getting are no longer the same as before. He figures maybe now he can start talking to them a little, seeing as their attitudes seem to be softening. One of the demon trainees approaches Vice Commander Merlin and informs her that young Master Christian has also come to train today. Merlin doesn't respond. She remains deep in thought about Christian's intentions, especially after the duel he had with his brother, Turn. His precision in targeting weak points, his use of mana despite Turn's excellent movements, and ultimately his victory in that match, all suggested he could read the battlefield with absolute clarity. If her suspicions are correct, Christian might even be more talented than Lord Ashe de Baron, the heir of the main family. But she quickly rejects that idea, convincing herself that Christian is nothing more than a degenerate scoundrel, with mana damaged beyond repair by his corrupt lifestyle, and that this gap cannot be closed now. At that moment, Merlin hears a commotion from outside, steps out of her tent, and asks what's going on, only to find the trainees all gathered in one spot. One of them tells her there's a simple duel taking place between young Master Christian and one of the trainees. She's shocked to hear the name Kenyon, since he's a first-star demon, which implies that Christian has reached the same level. Chris says he had hoped to test the skills of the so-called Great Black Swamp Knights, but finds them far below the reputation they're supposed to have. He asks if anyone is brave enough to fight him. Then he provokes them further, saying they're clearly just a bunch of cowardly knights afraid to face real combat. One trainee can no longer stand the insult and steps forward, declaring he'll put an end to this. Christian laughs and tells him to come at him. Everything is going exactly as he planned, and they're all taking the bait without realizing it. They're now willingly teaching him the secret techniques of the knights. He had no other choice but to steal them this way. Chris focuses on the sword grip, the fluid footwork, and recognizes the style immediately. Mudblade, a technique he'd heard of before, and now feels confident he could imitate. And just like that, Christian defeats another knight, leaving everyone stunned. No one can believe the same scoundrel once labeled as weak has returned with this level of strength, especially after rumors claimed his dark core was broken. So how did he reach the first star? Christian addresses them, saying he's disappointed. He'd had high expectations of the knights. He then turns to Merlin, telling her she's also responsible for their poor skills and low standards. The trainees are stunned by his boldness in speaking to the vice commander that way. As if digging his own grave, Merlin responds, saying she understands he's excited over his unexpected victory, but believes he's letting it go to his head. Chris replies that she's welcome to show him the true skill she claims the Black Swamp Knights possess. His words enrage Merlin. She grabs a knight's sword and strikes toward Chris with force. He's unable to move, and the blade narrowly misses him. She tells him it would take her less than a second to take down an arrogant brat like him. Chris responds by asking if she really intends to use her full power on someone like him, and reminds her that first-star black magic is forbidden. Merlin replies that she doesn't need to use anything special. She could break both his legs with just half the strength she used. Chris tells her he's willing to wager both legs. Then he asks what she's willing to bet in return. Merlin replies that she's ready to accept any terms, because she's absolutely certain he won't be walking out of this place ever again. Chris and Merlin begin their duel, and it quickly becomes a fierce and intense battle. Chris barely manages to keep up with the vice commander's relentless attacks. The knights watch with intense focus, surprised that anyone could last this long against her, though they assume it's only because she isn't using her main weapon. But Merlin herself starts to feel something strange. Her strikes don't seem to be landing at all. What's more, it's clear that Chris doesn't match her in power, which makes the situation all the more puzzling. To her, the whole thing feels just like the fight he had with Turn, as if history is repeating itself. Chris laughs and tells her things aren't going the way she wants, that the fight is moving in an entirely different direction. Merlin snaps at him to shut up. She begins charging energy into her sword, preparing to unleash a powerful magical strike. Chris realizes this is the opportunity he's been waiting for. He rushes forward with incredible speed and slams his head into her face before she can launch her attack, forcing her to halt the strike. Shocked, Merlin clutches her nose to stop the bleeding, stunned by what just happened, while Chris silently thanks his luck for the plan working. He knew Merlin was a swordmaster who relied heavily on magic, and since dark magic at their level is forbidden, there would be a brief opening in her defenses. He chose that moment to strike. Given her talent with the blade, she might not have survived had he used a more lethal attack. Despite likely losing, Merlin laughs and admits she never imagined a headbutt would be what ended the fight. She concedes that she underestimated him far too much, and from now on, she'll take things more seriously. Chris replies that the fight is already over, pointing to a spot on her neck. He tells her he scratched her with his fingernail during the blow, and if it had been laced with poison, she knows exactly what the result would have been. Merlin acknowledges her defeat and asks what he wants, then requests another duel. Chris gives her a sly look and says that if there's going to be a rematch, he wants something in return. Merlin agrees to grant whatever he asks. Chris grins and says that in that case, she shouldn't mind kneeling before him. Merlin is stunned by the request. She tells him he surely knows that such a demand is impossible. Her loyalty lies with the Baron family, the ruling bloodline of the Dark Magic clan. Chris replies that he's aware, and also knows she was cast out of the main family, but that could change if he became the heir. Merlin scoffs, saying that's absurd. The 5 recognized heirs are all direct descendants of the main bloodline. Chris responds with a comment saying, even a branch may become the root one day. He adds that, in any case, he accepts her challenge for a second match, but it will happen 1 month from now, without any restrictions. Merlin agrees, warning him that if that's the case, he won't stand a chance. She will be the one to win next time. Chris smirks darkly and tells her sometimes, even an egg can crack a stone. Either way, they'll meet again in a month, and they'll see what happens. Chris then heads to his father and presents him with Vice Commander Merlin's letter of recommendation, asking him to read it himself. He adds mockingly that the Vice Commander's basic skills as a demon are decent, but she could really use more training. Lord Khazar recalls when Merlin came to him and said the young master was a genius, able to defeat those with solid foundations, even if their rank was low. She even admitted that he had defeated her personally, which deeply shocked Khazar. She continued by saying the duel had been thrilling, and she hadn't enjoyed a match like that in a long time. Khazar looks at his son, wondering if he truly has changed this time, but Chris doesn't understand why his father is staring at him like that. In the end, Lord Khazar says that as promised, he will keep his word, and hands him the key to the library. Chris feels a sense of pride, having finally obtained the key to the library, and even managing to leave an impression on Vice Commander Merlin. He was fully aware that Merlin was a demon from the main branch of the Dark Magic clan, and during the Age of Ruin, she had risen to become a high-ranking 6-star demon who played a key role back then. That's why, if he intends to take control of the entire Dark Magic clan, he must first earn her loyalty. Though he's still not fully grown, he's confident that 1 month will be enough to prove himself worthy of it. Chris recalls the look Lord Khazar gave him before he left, and wonders if it might have been a sign of fatherly affection, meaning even demons have emotions within their families. He considers that maybe he can become a better father than the one he had in his past life, and decides he will make Lord Khazar proud. Chris enters the library to find it vast, filled with books on blood magic, summoning, and curse magic. He knew these books were strictly forbidden in the Lands of Light. Just as he reaches for one, Banshee suddenly appears from between the shelves, startling Chris into jumping back in fright. He asks what she's doing here. She replies that this is her natural domain. She is, in fact, the library's keeper. This completely shocks Chris. She then asks if he came here just to spend time with her. This annoys Chris deeply. He has no idea how to deal with someone like her, especially since he's certain she won't leave him alone. Banshee informs him that the book he picked is ranked 4 stars and falls under dark magic. Its title is Binding Seal. She adds that he probably won't understand much of it yet, but Chris insists that he's a genius, and it won't take him long. Banshee remarks that not only is the young master handsome, he's a genius too. Her expression carries something strange that Chris can't quite read. She then asks if there's a specific reason he chose that book. Chris says there is. He needs to catch a rat. By rat, he means one of 2 people, either his brother Turn, who he considers useless and the one he hates most in the family, or Cox, the head servant, a suspicious figure who oddly has free access to the discipline wing despite not being a family member. Given that demons value strength over status, it's strange that Cox puts so much effort into pleasing Chris and staying close to him. This shady man might be something entirely different than he appears to be. Chris still knows nothing about him, but placing the hallucination stone in the discipline wing was clearly a move to destroy him. For that reason, Chris decides to pretend to be weak, as if he's reverted to his old self. The one who shows excitement over this change would surely be the real culprit. During training, he starts faking exhaustion from running. Then he tells the others to keep doing their dumb drills while he's tired of it all and no longer feels like training. The other trainees are baffled, not understanding what's come over Chris all of a sudden. Later at dinner, Chris throws his food on the floor and yells at the maid, scolding her for not preparing a proper meal. He orders her out of his sight and demands she return the food and bring him something better, sparking Lord Khazar's fury. Khazar angrily declares that he was a fool to think his son had truly changed, Now he sees he's just gone back to who he always was. Chris feels an odd sense of guilt he can't explain, but he knows he can't stop what he's doing. It's something he must do for the sake of the Khazar family. In the days that follow, Chris continues spreading the image of his old self, mistreating servants and spending money recklessly. Banshee asks him if he's truly returned to his old habits, telling him that even if he has, she'll still stay by his side no matter what. Chris replies that, as he said before, he intends to catch a rat. He then activates a magic skill, and Banshee is shocked, asking if he's already mastered the binding seal technique. Chris responds confidently, stating that he's a genius. Not only did he master the skill, he even modified it to be usable by lower-ranked demons. He wasn't just passing time, he also learned other magic techniques in his spare hours. Banshee looks at him with admiration and says he truly is a genius, but their conversation is suddenly interrupted by Turn's arrival. Chris quickly pretends to space out and asks what brought him here. Turn yells at his brother, demanding to know if he's gone back to his old, disgraceful habits. He had thought Chris had changed and abandoned his reckless ways. Chris smiles, realizing that Turn's anger and confusion mean he's not a suspect. He replies that he believes there's a rat in the estate. Turn asks what exactly he means, and Chris explains that someone is trying to corrupt him again. That's why he's pretending to have reverted to his former self. Turn asks if it's all just an act. Chris says he should trust him, and that this very act proves he's not who he used to be. Turn then asks who he suspects the rat to be. Chris replies that it's hard to pinpoint for now, but soon everything will become clear, and the one they're looking for will be exposed. Chris then heads to where the servant Cox is, catching him by surprise. Cox asks what brings him here. Chris pours a bottle of juice over him and tells him it's not what he asked for. He then asks if Cox is now ignoring his orders. Cox replies that he'd never dare and will go immediately to fetch the correct one. Chris insists that he wants him specifically to bring it this time. Cox replies that he's currently busy and won't be able to. Chris responds that if that's the case, he clearly can't do his job like this. Since he needs to change his clothes anyway, he can go and come back later to finish his duties. Cox restrains his frustration and says he'll go and return quickly, while Chris feels something suspicious about him. The fact that he can endure this much humiliation either means he's planning something, or has unnatural patience. Chris glances at the papers Cox had been reading and senses that he might finally be close to uncovering something important. He had suspected that if Cox really was the rat, he must also be meddling in estate affairs, but that alone wasn't enough. He still needed stronger evidence. Just then, Cox returns quickly, informing Chris that he brought exactly what he asked for. Chris thanks him, and casually asks if he's angry with him. Cox replies that he could never be upset with him. Chris forces a fake smile and tells him that people like him are his favorite kind. Then he thanks him again and says there was actually something important he wanted to tell him from the beginning. Chris asks what it is. Cox informs him that his friends have requested to meet him in secret at their usual place, and warns him not to get too close to them. He adds that he couldn't refuse their request, given they are the young master's friends. Chris says he'll go meet them now, and he notes that things seem to be going even better than he anticipated. Chris heads to meet his so-called friends, who tell him they've heard rumors about his supposed change in behavior recently, but he's barely paying attention to their words. He notices they're using a small girl as a servant to pour their drinks. That's when he realizes they're actual scumbags, no different from the old Christian. As he raises the cup to his lips, he catches a strange scent. One of them asks why he's hesitating to drink. Chris doesn't answer. Instead, he smashes the cup in his face and dumps the entire drink over him. The friend is shocked and asks what that was about. Chris replies that his actions made it obvious he tampered with the drink, and from the way he reacted just now, it's very clear what was inside that cup. Chris uses his magic to lull the little girl to sleep. He doesn't want her to witness what he's about to do to those men. He asks his so-called friends if they really thought he wouldn't resort to dark magic or something similar, then tells them this isn't the time to act surprised. He grabs their heads and slams them violently against the table, hard enough that they can barely breathe. Chris calmly tells them to relax, assuring them that nothing will happen if they cooperate, while the two tremble in fear. His tone suddenly shifts as he pulls a dagger from his pocket, telling them that if they still haven't figured out why he's doing this, even after all those hits, then chances are they won't be leaving this place alive. Chris ties them up and starts beating them mercilessly. They quickly begin begging for mercy, promising to tell him everything. They confess that someone ordered them to lure him out, drug him, and kill the little girl to frame him for the crime. They say they were blackmailed with the drugs they had smuggled and had no choice but to go along. Chris asks who gave the order, but they remain silent, until he coldly asks if they truly wish to die here. In a panic, they both blurt out the same name, Cox. Chris demands they swear it, and they do, twice, insisting Cox was the one behind it all. Chris tells them he's going to bind them with a magical oath and casts a spell that forces them to obey his commands from now on. Elsewhere, Cox rushes to Lord Khazar, claiming that a disaster has occurred and he must know about it immediately. Lord Khazar asks what exactly has happened, and Cox tells him that the young master, in a drunken state, murdered his maid, and threw her body into the river. He adds that it's a completely unmanageable situation and he doesn't know how to handle it. Lord Khazar is shaken by what he hears. He orders Cox to bring Christian before the demon court and declares that he will personally oversee the trial. In the courtroom, Chris is brought before the judges and declares that he's innocent, that he did nothing. Lord Khazar asks if he's lying, pointing out that there are witnesses. Chris replies that the incident didn't happen to begin with, so how could there possibly be witnesses? Then he adds that maybe it's just a misunderstanding, and at that moment, the little maid enters through the doors. Chris asks if this, by chance, is the girl they're claiming to be dead. The girl says that young Master Christian escorted her home last night after she fainted and even gave her money to pay her rent. She then points to two men in the room and says they're the ones who spiked Christian's drink. Chris's friends are stunned by her testimony. They realize she's betrayed them. But Chris activates his magic and the oath he placed on them, forcing them to confess. And sure enough, under the influence of the spell and with no way to resist, they admit everything, that all the accusations were true, and they had filed a false report because Cox paid them to frame Christian. Hearing this, Cox starts shouting in protest, claiming the whole thing is nonsense, a complete fabrication. He insists this isn't justice, and accuses Christian of conspiring with others against him. He turns to Christian, yelling that this has gone too far and demanding that he stop with these tricks. But Chris completely ignores him. Then Chris turns to Lord Khazar and says that, since he's the victim here, he has a request to make. Lord Khazar asks what it is. Chris tells him he wishes to interrogate head servant Cox himself, instead of having Lord Khazar preside. Lord Khazar is taken aback by the unusual request, but in the end, he agrees. Cox is stunned by the decision, but Lord Khazar ignores him and tells Chris that he will now hand him the judge's seat, but warns him, if he oversteps or acts inappropriately, the privilege will be revoked immediately. Chris replies that he'll be quick and gets up to take the judge's platform. He announces, in the name of the grand judgment of the Magic Empire, in the name of His Majesty the Demon King, and as a representative of Count Khazar of the Dark Magic Clan, which governs the eastern wing of the Southern Magic Kingdom, I hereby begin the interrogation of the accused. Chris asks the servant Cox if he swears to answer truthfully, nothing but the truth, to every question that will be asked. Cox swears. Chris then asks him to swear again, and now that Cox has sworn twice, Chris is able to activate the binding seal spell on him. The crowd watches in awe, wondering how someone so young could master a 4th-star black magic spell with such precision. This particular seal was a modified version of a traditional binding spell, allowing even lower-ranked users to cast it, but with one condition: the target must swear twice, which is exactly what Cox had just done. Chris tells him he is now magically bound to speak only the truth. He then asks why Cox tried to frame him with a false charge by bribing his friends. Cox, without realizing it, responds that he was ordered to do so, and that someone had been blackmailing him, threatening to expose all his illegal activities, just to destroy the young master. Chris asks who that person is. Cox tries to resist the spell's influence, but the pain overwhelms him. At last, he confesses that the one who gave the order was Lord Asht, leaving everyone in the room stunned. That meant Lord Asht de Baron, the second son of the main family of the Dark Magic Clan, was the one who had targeted Chris. Cox says he's certain he'll be killed for this, and that he needs to flee as soon as possible. But before he can move, Chris draws his sword and slashes Cox's neck in the blink of an eye. Count Khazar and everyone present are left in shock, unable to believe the sudden drama unfolding before them. Chris declares that, on behalf of Count Khazar, and based on the proven charge against the servant Cox, he has carried out the proper sentence.